In a small, peaceful town nestled between towering trees and rolling hills, there lived a dog named Max. Max wasn't just any dog. He was a golden retriever with a keen sense for danger, a heart of gold, and a loyalty that ran deep. Max belonged to the Parker family, a kind-hearted couple, Sarah and Michael, and their 2 children, Lily and Ben. The Parkers lived in an old house, one that had seen better days but was full of love and memories. It was a house that had witnessed the growth of their family and was now home to their precious dog, Max. The Parker family had always felt safe in their home, surrounded by nature. However, their house was nestled under the shade of a massive oak tree that loomed over their property like a giant sentinel. This tree was ancient, its roots deep in the earth, and its branches stretched high into the sky, providing a comforting canopy of green. Over the years, the oak had become a symbol of safety and stability to the Parkers. But unknown to them, the tree was slowly becoming a ticking time bomb. Max had always been a perceptive dog. He was quick to notice things others might overlook, whether it was the faintest change in the weather, a new scent in the air, or the subtle shifts in the ground beneath his paws. Lately, he had been acting a bit strange. He would bark at nothing, stare out the window for hours, and often pace around the house with an anxious look in his eyes. Sarah, Michael, and the kids didn't think much of it at first, attributing his behavior to a shift in the seasons or maybe just a bit of boredom. But Max's instincts were trying to tell them something. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the house, Max was outside, his paws gently pressing into the soft earth as he sniffed the air. He was pacing more than usual, his fur bristling with unease. Sarah noticed him through the kitchen window, his ears perked up, eyes darting back and forth. She called to him, but he didn't respond. Instead, he continued to circle the oak tree in a tight, anxious pattern. "Max?" Sarah muttered to herself, setting down the dish she was washing and walking toward the door. "What's gotten into you today?" Max, however, seemed to ignore her. His focus was entirely on the tree, his gaze fixed upward, his tail lowered and stiff. Sarah's curiosity was piqued, and she stepped outside to join him. The moment her foot hit the porch, she felt an unusual chill in the air, as though the world around her had suddenly grown quieter, the usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves muted. "Max," she called again, but he turned and bounded toward her, his body tense and alert. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a split second, she could see a glimmer of something, fear, urgency, and an unspoken plea for her to understand. Max barked once, sharp, forceful. Then he darted toward the front door of the house, looking back at her as though trying to communicate something vital. It was then that Sarah noticed something odd. The tree, the one that had always been so reliable, seemed to groan in the wind, its branches swaying unnaturally. She had never heard such a sound before, and her heart began to race. "Michael," Sarah called urgently, her voice trembling. "Michael, come quickly." Inside, Michael was reading the evening paper, unaware of the growing tension outside. But when he heard the urgency in Sarah's voice, he quickly dropped the paper and rushed to the door. "What is it?" he asked, his brow furrowing as he stepped onto the porch. Sarah pointed toward the oak tree. "Something's wrong. Max, he's acting strange." Max was now standing by the door, his body blocking the entrance, his tail low and still. He stared at Michael, then turned back to the tree, and finally gave a loud, insistent bark. Michael followed his gaze, his eyes narrowing. He could hear it now too, a strange creaking noise coming from the tree. A low, ominous groan, like the sound of a heavy weight shifting. The tree, which had stood for centuries, was showing signs of stress, the mighty oak shaking in a way that no one had ever seen before. "We need to get inside," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "That tree. Something's wrong with it." Without another word, Michael ushered Sarah and the kids inside. Max followed them, but not before giving the tree one last, lingering look. His paws made a soft click against the wooden floorboards as he hurried into the house, a place he had always considered safe. But something was telling him that tonight would be different. As the family settled into the living room, Michael quickly locked the door behind them, casting a concerned glance toward the window that faced the tree. The creaking sound continued, growing louder and more intense, until it was all they could hear. Max stood by the door, his eyes locked on the window, his body rigid. He knew something was coming, something dangerous. But would it be enough to warn them in time? It wasn't until they were all gathered together, the tension in the air thick and palpable, that the first loud crack split the silence. The crack that echoed through the air sounded like a thunderclap, loud and jarring, cutting through the stillness of the evening. It came from the oak tree, and the moment the sound reached the Parker family, something inside Sarah's chest tightened with fear. The air, once filled with the quiet hum of evening life, was now heavy with an unshakable sense of dread. Max, ever the vigilant protector, stood rigid by the door, his ears back and his eyes fixed on the source of the noise. He had heard it before, that same eerie creak that had started hours ago. But now it was clear, the tree was no longer just swaying in the wind, it was about to come down. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shudder as if it too could sense the impending disaster. Sarah and Michael exchanged a brief look of panic before rushing to the windows to peer outside. Through the darkness, the silhouette of the mighty oak loomed, its branches moving with unnerving speed. The tree, once steady and reassuring, was swaying violently in the wind, its trunk bending at an unnatural angle. It was no longer a question of if the tree would fall, it was a matter of when. "Michael, we need to get out of here." Sarah's voice was urgent, her heart racing. She grabbed Lily and Ben, who had come into the room at the sound of the first crack, and pulled them toward the door. "Max knows something's wrong. We have to move, now." But Max didn't need to be told twice. He had already started barking, louder now, as though urging them to hurry. His paws scrabbled at the door, his gaze darting back to the tree, then to his family. He barked again, sharp, insistent, his eyes never leaving them. He could sense the danger, and he wasn't about to let them ignore it. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he quickly ushered his family out the back door. "Stay close to the house," he instructed, his voice tight with urgency. "Head for the garden. It's open there, we'll be safer." As they moved swiftly through the backyard, Max was right by their side, running ahead but always looking back, ensuring his family was following. They reached the garden just as the wind picked up, gusting with a ferocity that rattled the windows of the house. The trees creaking grew louder, echoing like the groans of a massive, ancient beast in agony. Max barked again, more urgently now, as if warning them to move faster. Then, with a sudden, deafening crash, the oak tree came down. It was as if time itself slowed. The enormous tree, once towering and majestic, fell in a devastating arc, its branches reaching out like arms, desperate to grasp anything in its path. The sound of breaking wood, snapping branches, and the crushing of the earth below was all-consuming. It seemed to shake the very foundations of the house, and the ground beneath their feet quivered with the force of the impact. The massive oak, with its thick trunk and wide canopy, had been an immovable part of the landscape for decades. Now, it was nothing more than a violent, collapsing mass of branches and debris. Max had already reached the farthest edge of the garden with the Parker family in tow when the tree fell. As it crashed to the ground, the air was filled with the deafening roar of splintering wood. Sarah screamed in shock, instinctively pulling her children closer to her, shielding them with her body as best as she could. Max barked again, but this time it wasn't a warning, it was a triumphant cry of success. The family had made it. The dust settled in the air, and for a moment, all was silent, save for the distant rustling of branches and the heavy breaths of Max, who was standing a few feet away, panting with exertion. The Parker family stood frozen in place, their hearts still racing, the adrenaline of the close call pumping through their veins. Sarah and Michael turned to look back at the house. The massive oak tree now lay across the front of their home, its once imposing trunk now reduced to a pile of broken branches, the debris scattered everywhere. It was an unbelievable sight. The house had been completely engulfed by the fallen tree, its roof caved in under the weight of the massive branches. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "If we hadn't listened to Max." Her words trailed off as she stared at the destruction before her. The house that had been their safe haven, the place where they had shared birthdays, holidays, and countless memories, was now unrecognizable. It was a miracle that they had gotten out in time, that they had been warned, and that they were safe. Michael looked down at Max, who was standing by their side, his tail wagging in quiet triumph, his eyes bright and alert, as if he had known all along what needed to be done. "You saved us, boy," Michael murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Max barked once, as if in acknowledgement, then turned his attention to the family. He had done his job, his instincts guiding him with precision, and now he was content, knowing that his family was safe. But there was no time to waste in their moment of relief. The storm was still raging, and the winds were picking up again. The tree had caused significant damage, and there was no telling what else the night might bring. Sarah, Michael, Lily, Ben, and Max stood together, their bond stronger than ever. As they huddled in the garden, watching the storm swirl around them, they knew that their journey wasn't over yet. The storm continued to rage as the Parker family huddled together in their garden, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and broken branches. Max stood protectively by their side, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, as if ensuring that the danger had passed. But there was no mistaking the urgency in his posture. The family had narrowly escaped death, but their ordeal was far from over. The wind howled through the trees, the remnants of the storm whipping through the broken branches of the fallen oak. Sarah clutched Lily and Ben tightly, their small bodies trembling from the shock of what had just happened. Michael, his face pale, kept glancing toward their house, his mind racing. The devastation before them was overwhelming. The once sturdy house was now a ruin, crushed under the weight of the fallen tree. The roof had caved in, windows were shattered, and parts of the walls had been torn apart. Their home was no longer safe. "Michael," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper as she held Ben closer. "What do we do now? We can't go back in there." Michael swallowed hard, his throat tight. "We'll figure it out, Sarah. We just need to stay calm." But calm was a difficult thing to find in that moment. The adrenaline that had surged through their bodies moments earlier had begun to ebb, leaving behind a deep sense of exhaustion and disbelief. They had been so sure of their safety in that house, so certain that nothing could harm them. But in a matter of seconds, their world had been turned upside down. Max, sensing the tension in the air, trotted over to Michael, his tail wagging, but his eyes still watchful, as if scanning for the next threat. Michael knelt down to rub his head, the touch grounding him in the chaos around them. "You did good, Max," Michael murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us." Max's response was to nudge his nose into Michael's hand, then look toward the family, as if to reassure them that all was well, at least, as well as it could be in the face of the destruction they'd just witnessed. His sharp instincts had kept them out of harm's way, but now, as the storm continued to churn around them, the next question was how to survive in the aftermath. The family stood there for a few minutes longer, just taking in the devastation. The wind had begun to die down, the rain slowing to a gentle drizzle. In the distance, they could hear sirens wailing as emergency responders arrived to assess the damage to the neighborhood. Sarah pulled out her phone, but there was no signal. The storm had knocked out the power, and the town's communication lines were down. "Okay," Sarah said, taking a deep breath. "We need to find somewhere safe. I don't want to just stand here. We should head toward town." Michael nodded in agreement. "Yeah, let's move quickly. We need to get somewhere out of the wind. Maybe the shelter down the road is open. They'll have blankets, food, and a place to stay." As the family began to move, Max trotted ahead, his keen senses still alert. The streets were eerily silent now, the storm's fury leaving behind an unsettling calm. Broken branches and debris littered the ground, and in the distance, the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles illuminated the darkened landscape. Max stopped occasionally to sniff the ground, checking for any signs of danger or anyone else who might be in need of help. His protective instinct remained strong, and he stayed close to his family as they walked along the edge of the road, careful to avoid the wreckage of fallen trees and downed power lines. It didn't take long for them to reach the shelter, a sturdy brick building that had withstood the worst of the storm. A few other families had already gathered there, and inside, volunteers were working quickly to distribute food and supplies. When the Parkers entered, the shelter manager, a kind woman named Ruth, welcomed them with a warm smile, though her eyes were filled with concern. "We saw your house on the news," Ruth said, her voice soft with sympathy. "You're lucky to be alive. That tree, it came down fast, didn't it?" Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes as she looked at Max. "This dog saved our lives. If it weren't for him, we'd be..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Ruth's eyes softened as she knelt down to scratch Max behind the ears. "He's a hero, for sure. I've never seen a dog act with such instinct before." Max, ever humble, merely wagged his tail in response. He wasn't looking for praise, he had simply done what he had been trained to do: protect his family. But in that moment, as Sarah and Michael settled into a corner of the shelter with Lily and Ben, it became clear that Max wasn't just a dog. He was their protector, their guardian, and the reason they had made it out of the house alive. As the night wore on, the storm finally passed, leaving behind a sky littered with clouds, but the threat had faded. The Parkers sat together on the floor of the shelter, wrapped in blankets and surrounded by other survivors, as they began to process everything that had happened. They still didn't know the full extent of the damage to their home or how long it would take to rebuild their lives, but one thing was certain: they had each other. And they had Max, who had shown them that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Later that evening, as the shelter began to quiet down, Michael stood outside for a moment to breathe in the fresh, cool air. He looked up at the stars, trying to wrap his mind around everything that had happened. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft padding of paws behind him. Max had followed him outside, his presence as comforting as it had ever been. "You're a lifesaver, Max," Michael said quietly, his voice barely audible in the still night. "I don't know how to repay you for what you did. You kept us safe when it counted." Max gave a soft woof in response, then leaned against Michael's leg, his body warm and solid. He wasn't looking for thanks, he had done his job. And in that moment, Michael realized that sometimes, the greatest gift wasn't something that could be repaid with words or actions. It was the simple, unwavering loyalty of a dog who would do anything to keep his family safe. Max wasn't just a pet. He was family, and as long as they had him by their side, the Parkers knew they would be okay.